Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our final session of Back to the Basics Cycle of Jewish Life. This evening, we're going to be focusing on divorce, weddings, marriage, and associated aspects of that section of the cycle of Jewish life. My main focus this evening is to present to you the conservative movements or some conservative movement options for gay marriage. And in doing this detailed analysis of the actual language of the wedding ceremony that is being suggested for weddings for non-heterosexual couples, we'll of course have to ask the question, what are the traditional words for heterosexual couples, and how are these changes different and significant? And through looking at that question, we are going to be pondering what makes a Jewish wedding Jewish altogether. So before we jump into that section of our program, which is the bulk of what we're going to do tonight, I felt like we couldn't do Jewish weddings without starting with divorce, because in fact, before there was Jewish marriage, there was Jewish divorce. So the Torah doesn't describe marriage. It doesn't talk about the Ketubah. Of course, in the Torah, there are couples, people who are married, but the Torah doesn't give us any real insight into the marriage ceremony itself or what consecrated marriage or anything like that. We do have some instances in the Torah of betrothal or engagement, where, for example, with Isaac and Rebekah, where Abraham's servant Eliezer goes and negotiates Rebekah's marriage to Isaac, and so we have that betrothal scene, but we do not have a real example of, okay, this is a Jewish wedding, and this is what it means. And our legal texts don't have that contained in the Torah itself. But what Jewish legal texts in the Torah have is a description of divorce. So from Deuteronomy chapter 24, if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and I'm not gonna go deeply into what ervat davar means, whether it's erva plus davar or whether it has to be an erva davar. The Talmud discusses those two words at great length. Something indecent about her is one possible translation of that. And he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house. So before we have a wedding ceremony, we have a divorce ceremony. And the divorce ceremony has basically been very, very stable since, pre-Talmudic times, almost since biblical times. Even to this day, Jewish divorce is done in writing as described in Deuteronomy. There are lots of questions in the Talmud about what you can write your certificate of divorce on. What kind of ink are you allowed to use to write your certificate of divorce? If you're married to two women named Rachel and you write a certificate of divorce to Rachel without specifying which Rachel, what happens if it accidentally gets delivered to the wrong wife? And so the Talmud is full of questions related to Jewish divorce. Even the traditional Jewish marriage contract itself, which we're going to look at in some detail later in this program, the Ketubah, right? The Ketubah does mention responsibilities in the marriage, okay, but it focuses on the financial obligations incumbent upon the parties of the dissolution of the marriage by divorce or by death. What is the ketubah, the marriage contract really. It is a promise that the property of the groom will be liened, will be mortgaged up to the amount specified in the document to be paid first to his widow before any of his other debtors. And so if he dies in debt to a lot of people, his wife gets her ketubah first. And that was a way that the Jewish community protected one of the most vulnerable populations in ancient society, which is a widow, especially a widow with children, because that person didn't necessarily have financial means of support, and the community would otherwise have to feed and clothe this person. And so the way that functioned was that the man promises at the time of the wedding that if the wedding dissolves by divorce or by death, she is entitled to the total amount of her ketubah. And ketubah, the word ketubah, refers both to the marriage document and to the amount of money that is promised within that marriage document. So it's almost like the traditional Jewish marriage contract is a prenuptial agreement, right? It's not, it's like, to use the modern lingo, it's, if this doesn't work out, you only get, 15% of whatever, like it's a, they imagined it as a way of protecting the widow, who is a vulnerable person in society. But the way that it actually plays out, just like in modern times, is the party that comes into the marriage with more money, which in a lot of parts of Jewish history, was the woman, because she came in sometimes, with money from her father's household, from her family, that she has a certain amount of power, leverage with regard to the terms of the marriage and the terms of the divorce. So I guess, and I tell this to couples when I meet with them to discuss their upcoming wedding. I say, before Jewish marriage comes Jewish divorce, and Judaism acknowledges that a marriage isn't forever necessarily. Obviously, there's a desire that we want people to get married and to stay married forever. And we understand that it doesn't always happen that way, and that's okay. That there is unlike in some traditions that have very negative views toward divorce, Judaism understands that divorce is sometimes a necessary part of this whole process. And a Talmud devotes an entire tractate to Gittin, to Masachet Gittin, to the study of divorce, understanding very deeply the necessity of ending a marriage. On the very last page of Gittin, after, and the Talmuds, like I gave some examples of some of the questions that the Talmud asks with regard to divorce, related to, what you can write the get on, and who has to deliver the get, and can you appoint a shaliach, a messenger, an emissary to deliver the get, and if you appoint an emissary, can that emissary appoint an emissary, and what happens if the emissary is lost, right? All of these questions are contained in the Talmud. On the very last page, page 9db, the second half of the folio of the last page of the Talmud, it says, the last passage, Rabbi Elazar says, with regard to anyone who divorces his first wife, even the altar, even the mizbeach, sheds tears over him. And then there's a quote from Malachi, which connects to a theological approach, right? That is to say, divorce is associated in some way with God's relationship with the Jewish people, which is considered to be a covenantal relationship, a covenant just like marriage is a covenant in Judaism, a covenant between two people. And the relationship between God and the people of Israel, we would like to hope, is a forever covenant. But since we have the concept of divorce, since we know that divorce is possible, what if God divorces us? What if God divorces Israel? That is a present theme throughout the prophets. And there's this sense that even God, even the altar, even God is sad, like cries tears over a marriage that ends in divorce, especially a first marriage that ends in divorce, because you hope that a marriage will last forever. But in spite of that sadness, there is also an understanding that divorce is necessary at times. So I do want to mention a couple of other things about divorce. One is there's a problem because Jewish divorce is not egalitarian, as even in our movement, the Jewish tradition is from that verse in Deuteronomy that we read. It's, if a man chooses to divorce his wife. Now, in Judaism, we have both parties can ask for a divorce, right? That is to say, a woman can say, I want to divorce you. And a respectful and reasonable person, right, will say, okay, well, if you don't want to be in this marriage, then we'll get divorced, and that's fine. So we'll get separated. But the active party in a Jewish divorce is the male party, and the man has to give the writ of divorce to his wife, and without that, she is chained to him. She cannot get remarried according to Jewish law, and there is no equivalent Jewish legal requirement for the woman to give the man anything to substantiate that divorce. So this creates a problem called the aguna problem of chained women, a problem of women whose husbands refuse to give the get and then can extort sums of money or more favorable terms of parental custody of the children, lots of other things, property, right? So, and this does happen. It happens even today in our 21st century. It actually happens, I think, more today than it used to, because it used to be that there were more social controls of people. So in the shtetl, if a man tried to do this and would refuse to give his wife a get, the community had some social controls by which to force him to do so. They could ostracize him. They could not sell goods to him. They could, make it so that he walks into the kosher butcher to buy meat, and the kosher butcher won't sell to him because the community is trying to pressure him to give this divorce. There are even stories of groups of folks who might rough somebody up in order to force them to give a get. And so that used to happen every once in a while. I mean, none of this is particularly common, but today, Jewish communities do not have the same kind of leverage as they used to have. And so that leaves Jewish individuals with a lot of power. And Jewish individual men can hold that over their partner. So how do we understand this in conservative movement? First of all, one possible way to handle it is to include in the marriage contract the Lieberman clause. Most conservative ketubot come with a Lieberman clause. The Lieberman clause basically says, we agree at the time of signing this marriage contract, this ketubah, that if our marriage ends according, in the civil courts, that we also agree to show up to do the delivery of the get. So putting it right into the ketubah text itself. So that's very common in the conservative movement. In Orthodox settings, and more in conservative settings, there is the Lieberman clause is written in Aramaic. It's put into the ketubah. It's a promise, but so is getting married in a certain sense. Like, you expect that your partner that you're getting married to would have the decency to get divorced in the right way if divorce is necessary. So the Lieberman clause, while it is there, it doesn't necessarily hold legal weight in a civil court. So modern Orthodox rabbis and more and more conservative rabbis also require folks to sign what is often called the halachic prenup. It is an actionable document in English that is written in legal language that is connected to that would be actionable in, say, a New York State civil court, marriage court, that basically says the same thing, that requires that a person, that the man give a get in the case of a civil divorce. And so more and more rabbis are requiring their folks to sign the halachic prenup. The halachic prenup then could be acted upon in court if it came to that, and that returns the community some power to compel a person to end this agunah crisis, the crisis of the chained woman. Another way that this comes up is that some conservative rabbis have also started talking about writing in egalitarian provisions of, he has to give a get and she has to give a get, so that there's both sides release each, so that both parties release each other from the marriage. But it's hard to get around the fact that only one of those is legally required, and the other one would just be sort of by custom. All right, so that covers divorce. Before we move on to marriage, does anyone have was anything surprising in what I said? Do you have any questions? Did I explain it okay? Gary.
In the day of multiple wives, what, you could divorce any one of them? You said the first.
Yeah,
when did that tradition end?
Right. About 1,000 years ago, a little more than 1,000 years ago, the Rabbeinu Gershom was the greatest sage of his generation. He lived around the year 1000, and he ended the practice of polygamy in Judaism forever. He made a takana, a change to Jewish law, that ended the practice of polygamy for 1,000 years. Oh, his takana actually expired about a decade and a half ago, but everybody in the Jewish community seems to be acting like it's still in effect. 1,000 years of precedent is a lot of precedent, and we also, of course, in Judaism have a concept of dina de malchuta dina, the law of the land is the law, and polygamy is not the law of this land. Before that, Judaism had polygamy in the same way that Islam has polygamy, which is that you really could only be married to the number of wives that you could reasonably support on your income. So if you were really wealthy, you could support more wives, right? Again, like the Ketubah is a lien on your properties. You can't get married to more people than you can afford to end those marriages. So, and also to support them with food and clothing and sustenance and all of that. The Talmud imagines a world in which a man might indeed have more than one wife. But most of the rabbis only were married to one woman at a time. So like polygamy was never a very common practice in Judaism. But the Talmud does deal with that case. I mean, the case of like I said, if you had two wives and they both happen to be named the same thing. Which is why to get the divorce document actually requires you to list all of the nicknames, all of the names by which a person is known. So when you read out a divorce document, like it includes a lot of names. Yeah, Bob.
I was wondering if there's I had heard that there was a status of a wife that's a lower status, like a concubine or something like that, that has a lesser status than the chief wife. Was that something that was done, or because I heard there was some element of that among some Hasidic communities? Obviously not legal, but
yeah, the Torah does describe sort of a pilegesh, a concubine, a person who is not a full wife. And there has been, that is a category of Jewish law that is possible to understand as like maybe possible to invoke. Every once in a while you hear about cases where, right, there are three ways that you can affect a marriage according to Jewish law, right? One is by means of giving a gift in front of witnesses with a declaration that this gift is for the purpose of marriage. One is by document, by writing a Ketubah document, and one is by having sex. So there every once in a while you hear about cases of kids or youths in high school who have sex, and then their families find out about it and are worried that they are in fact now married legally, and that a get is necessary to end that relationship. And that like potentially might be true according to Jewish law. That I do not think that is necessarily how we practice. But one solution to that I had heard was to have a document of concubineship written up, and then it's not a real marriage, it's like some kind of lesser marriage that, you know, for the sake of this relationship to not be considered marriage. So then, you know, I know of no instances where that actually occurred, but I have heard of that. Even in the modern Orthodox community, I think people talk about that. I think because there's some, you know, discomfort around what are the Jewish ideas around premarital sex. Yeah, Gary.
okay.
One more question before you go on. If the girl is not Jewish or the guy is not Jewish, what's the legal obligation for a ketubah or a get and all of that?
The Jewish law does not recognize a marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew as having legal status. So such a marriage might have a civil status, and clearly it has a status socially. But from a halachic perspective, it doesn't have a formal legal status, and therefore wouldn't necessarily need a formal legal end. Mishka, last comment before we head on.
A question, just when we in this generation or these generations marry, husband or wife take on a different name or a label, Mr., Mrs., whatever. Is there any such thing in the fact that there isn't a formal wedding, but some change in the status that's reflected in somebody's name when they marry?
You mean in Jewish tradition?
Yeah, in Jewish tradition. So does somebody become Rachel, wife of? Is there some label that tells people this is a married person? Other kinds of indications? I mean, in the
mostly
title and so on.
Right. Mostly only social. That is, like keeping your hair covered, for instance. Wearing a wedding ring. There's no change in the name. Where this like really matters in Jewish law is with regard to a woman who marries a Kohen, then she is allowed, if the temple were to be rebuilt, to eat the truma, that is, to eat the sanctified food that is only allowed for Kohanim to eat. And a woman who grows up a Kohen and then gets married to a non-Kohen is no longer allowed to eat the truma. So those are the only ways that it really has any impact in Jewish law. There are some biblical figures who are known as Eshet so-and-so, as opposed to the daughter of so-and-so. But we like Jewish tradition tends to be fairly respectful of parents in that way, where our Hebrew names are related to our parents, not to our spouse.
Is there any change when somebody is divorced? If somebody is divorced, let's say, who has been wearing a sheitel for years, does that?
Yes, she no longer covers her hair when she's divorced. Yes, for sure. Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so what makes a Jewish wedding Jewish? I actually intend this to be an actual question. Throw out thoughts. What makes a Jewish wedding Jewish?
The people getting married are Jewish.
Okay, great. So Jewish participants in the marriage. What else?
Chuppah.
Okay, so great. The Jewish wedding happens under a chuppah.
A gift of some kind from the groom.
If the Jewish wedding didn't happen under a chuppah, but it was still two Jewish people, would it still be a Jewish wedding?
Yeah, that would just be a custom that you follow, I think,
Right.
right?
Okay, great. So maybe chuppah is an important element of our cultural understanding of, I'm at a Jewish wedding, I can tell because there's a chuppah in front. Right? But if you didn't have it, it would still be a Jewish wedding, potentially, maybe. All right. What?
Ketubah.
Okay, the ketubah, right?
And it's
the marriage contract.
And it's usually red.
Okay, and reading it as part of the wedding.
A gold wedding band.
Some kind of exchange or gift, whatever you want to call it.
Okay, great. So a non-Jewish wedding also usually has an exchange of rings. So while the rings are part of the Jewish wedding for sure, you can't necessarily point to that as the thing which makes the Jewish wedding Jewish, because 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 that also happens in non-Jewish weddings. So the ketubah is something that is unique to Jewish weddings, and I think what we need to think about is what is it about the ketubah that makes a ketubah, right? Is any wedding contract that we draw up, does that count as a ketubah? What is necessary in that ketubah that makes the ketubah specifically a ketubah? All right, and we'll look at that when we look at some examples of ketubah text. Henry.
Well, I was saying you were talking about the rings, but do other groups in society require that the ring be put on the right index finger?
So no, that's a uniquely Jewish sort of custom. But like the chuppah, if you just put the ring directly on your ring finger, it would still work. In fact, the gift that we give under the chuppah doesn't actually have to be a ring, right? That it can be anything that is of sufficient value. And the ring itself is actually a custom that is in some ways very much informed by the society in which we live, where we expect to be able to identify married people by wearing a ring. Yeah, Anita.
The ketubah is witnessed and signed.
Great. So we have marriage certificates in civil marriage in this country.
Mhm.
You have a marriage document, a marriage certificate, which is in some ways similar to a ketubah in that it's a wedding document that attests to the fact that the wedding happened. Now, different states are different about whether they require witnesses. So the state that I was married in Pennsylvania, did not require witnesses for the civil marriage document, which we were kind of surprised about. We had actually asked friends to sign it, and then we went to the courthouse to get it, and there was no place for signatures, and we had to go to our friends and be like, "Oops."
Interesting.
But many states do have the requirement of witnesses, of signatures of other people other than the couple. That in of itself is interesting because you might think that the ketubah or the wedding document or whatever is an agreement entered into by the couple, but actually it's testifying that the ketubah is a document of testimony. It is a witness statement that testifies that the couple entered into this agreement. It does not actually need to be signed by the bride and groom or by the brides, by the couple at all. The modern custom where the celebrants of the wedding also sign the ketubah is very, very recent, and even now, right, is not necessary. Okay. Just going to take.
It's not necessary to have a rabbi perform the wedding.
That's true. Though I do think that many rabbis are fairly good at it, and it's nice to have a rabbi as part of that. But no, there are no Jewish rituals that require a rabbi. That's not a thing in our religion. There are religions where the clergy are invested with particular power to enact rituals or sacraments that other people do not have the power to do ritually. But Judaism does not have that. There is nothing ritual that you need a rabbi for. Henry.
About the consummation of marriage.
Great. So many cultures have a sense that the marriage becomes real at consummation. The that sort of feeling in Judaism, right? So the marriage is real even if you never have sex, though certainly if you don't, you're sinning because you have a responsibility, right? One of the promises, one of the things that's written in the Ketubah is that you will engage in sexual relations with each other, but we do have a period of yichud, of being alone right after the wedding ceremony, and that is symbolic of sexual union, though that doesn't actually happen in yichud, probably. I mean, I've never really heard of that actually happening.
10 minutes.
I guess if it did happen, people wouldn't go around talking about it. Barbie.
What makes a Jewish wedding Jewish? What about the breaking of the glass at the end of the ceremony?
Yeah, right. So definitely there is a strong custom of breaking the glass, and that breaking the glass, right, symbolizes the brokenness, the ongoing brokenness of the world, and the hope that the marrying couple will bring more repair, will be a step toward redemption. If you didn't step on a glass, it would still be a marriage. It would still be a wedding. Of course, that is one of our major moments of, yes, I feel like I'm at a Jewish wedding because I stepped on a glass. Great. So we're going to talk about this stuff. All right. So the parts of a Jewish wedding ceremony. So I'm just going to read them all. There's the Tanayim, the Ufruf, the Mikvah, the Ketubah, the Bedekin, the Kidushin, the Nisuin, Yichud, and the Sheva Brachot. So these are the components of a Jewish wedding, and let's talk about each part of them. So what are Tanayim? The Tanayim is a Hebrew word that means conditions or terms, and it is a tradition of engagement. So after the decision to get married, when a couple gets engaged, there used to be a traditional ceremony at which the family of the bride and the family of the groom came together and discussed the financial obligations for the wedding. That is to say, who will pay for what parts of the wedding, right? And the marriage, what money is coming in to the marriage with this couple, who is taking care of the dishes, who is taking care of the linens, etc. Okay, and all of that was written up in a document and signed, and that was and you agreed that the wedding was going to happen on a particular date, right, in a particular city. All of those pieces were sort of contained in this document called Tanayim, sort of an ancient prenup. This was accompanied by the shattering of a plate to symbolize the entering into this moment. Nowadays, this ancient ritual has been appropriated or changed, and it is an opportunity to make promises. So if a couple wants to make vows as part of their wedding, this is where you could make vows, where you could set conditions, where you could say, we promise that we're never going to go to bed angry, or we promise that we're going to change the mezuzah scrolls once every 7 years, or whatever it is that you care about, that you want to sign your document, that the conditions of your marriage, something about having children. So making vows. Making vows is not a part of the Jewish chuppah ritual. So nobody said what makes a Jewish wedding Jewish: vows. I'm glad nobody said that. If we asked the other question, what makes a non-Jewish wedding non-Jewish? Vows might be one of the things that we say, right? Like when you watch a wedding in the movie, right? you expect that that wedding scene is going to have some vows. In fact, people sort of think about that, like, oh, are you writing your own vows, or are you going to say the like traditional vows, or do you want that like to have and to hold, to honor and to whatever, all of that sort of stuff? Not Jewish, right? In fact, the idea of vows, one to the other, is not what constitutes a Jewish wedding. But if you have folks who are really committed to the idea of making promises, making vows, the Tanayim is a great way to include it in a traditional way into a Jewish wedding. So then there's the Ufruf. The Ufruf is a party that you can have that contain, the most limited way of doing it is just to have an aliyah to the Torah and to be showered with candy. The custom that we have where we shower b'nai mitzvah with candy, it actually comes from Ufruf. It's the bride and the groom that should be showered with candy, that's wishing them a sweet marriage. Then it sort of got appropriated into b'nai mitzvah, but it has much less spiritual meaning there. This can be a really wonderful way, as I've written here, to include community members who are not necessarily going to be invited to the wedding in the celebration of this couple. So, before Rachel and I were married, we had an ufruf at my parents' home synagogue where I grew up, so that all of those people could come, and my parents sponsored Kiddush. Most of those people were not invited to the wedding. We also had an ufruf the weekend of our wedding at Rachel's parents' synagogue, and that allowed Rachel's parents to host their whole synagogue community, many of whom were invited, but not all of whom were invited to our wedding, right? And so it's a nice way to celebrate with more people. Mishka.
The word ufruf is clearly Yiddish. Is this just an Ashkenazi thing, or does it, calling a couple, which I assume at earlier times was just the male, to come up for an aliyah, is that something that is in Sephardi and Mizrahi and other communities?
I do believe that it is done in other communities, but it's done in different ways, right? There's the Shabbat before the wedding can be called a Shabbat Chatan, a groom's Shabbat, and often is the groom hangs out with his bridal party, the groomsmen, and that's a more Sephardi tradition, but it also includes an aliyat to Torah, and so whether you call it an ufruf or you call it something else, that tradition is ancient. So then there's mikvah, which is traditional to mark the transition from unreadiness to readiness for marriage by immersing in the mikvah's living waters. And for nowadays, both parties of the marriage, both grooms or the bride and the groom can do immerse. I recommend to all of my friends and people that I've officiated at their wedding that they do this, and that they have an opportunity each to bring their best friend or whoever to go to be a part of their immersion and preparation for wedding. That can be very, very nice. I know traditionally the woman has to anyway, because she is because of her, she's in nidah, she has menstruated and hasn't gone to the mikveh, and so she has to go before her wedding anyway, so that shows that she will be in a state of ritual purity and will be able to have sex after getting married. Great, so let's keep going. It's traditional to fast on your wedding day for both parties to the wedding. Couple should fast. The wedding day is considered to be a Yom Kippur Katan, a mini Yom Kippur. traditionally your sins are forgiven on the day of your wedding, and you come into that marriage a completely new person, right? You are rebirthed into that marriage, similar to the way that Yom Kippur is a ritual rebirth every year. That is, in some ways, a ritual death and resurrection every year, that you don't eat, you don't drink, you wear white, you abstain from all the things of living life, and at the end of the day, your sins are forgiven as if you had died and returned to life. And so, in some way, right, your childhood, your previous life, what came before ends at this moment of marriage, and you go into the wedding, you go into your marriage a new person, forgiven from all sin. And so that's why it's customary to fast on the day of your wedding. You also, by the way, customary to do the Yom Kippur liturgy, the vidui, on the day of your wedding. So
a caveat should be maybe said to folks who are doing that, and Bob chuckles about this often. We fasted before our wedding, which was at noon, which was a good thing in that regard. But right afterwards, Bob's two wonderful elderly great uncles gave us each scotch. And we did not do very well having scotch early afternoon on empty stomachs.
I recommend to all of my, anybody who asks my advice, I recommend to all of them to have the caterer put aside some food into yichud.
Yeah.
Because it's often a truism that you don't get to eat at your own wedding because you're spending so much time seeing people and being wished well and dancing and whatever. And so the only time you have to eat is that private time that you have where it's just the two of you and you're alone. So I tell people, tell the caterer what your favorite foods are, and even if they're not preparing it for anybody else, have them prepare your favorite foods, leave them in your, have them in the yichud room so that you can actually eat a nice meal of what you want to eat. You won't get to every hors d'oeuvre table or carving station or whatever that you have at your wedding. So if you really want to have something special, have that set aside in the yichud. That also helps with the drinking, because then before anybody else can hand you anything to drink, you'll have already been you'll have already had some food. So yes, I do recommend that, even for people who are not fasting on their wedding day. Ketubah. So we're going to look at the text of the Ketubah at length, but that's the contract. Then there's the bedekin. So bedekin is that word literally means to check, and it's checking that you have the right person under the veil. Jewish wedding ceremonies often begin with parties in separate rooms for each of the celebrants. These parties are sometimes referred to as the tish or as the kabbalat panim, and they include toasts, singing, words of Torah, sometimes hors d'oeuvres, and those parties end with the couple's friends and family dancing them to a joint location where they each participate in dressing the other. So this I've written very carefully as in an egalitarian or non-gendered way, right? So traditionally, of course, the man covers the woman with a veil, but that nowadays, while that might happen at this moment of bedekin, often the woman provides a kippah for the man to wear, or puts on the man's kittel, so that there's an aspect of each is dressing the other. And for two women or two men, that you can still do that, where you get to this joint moment and you have an opportunity to get the other person ready for the wedding in a very kind of intimate and beautiful way. that's also a moment of opportunity for parental blessings. And there is a tradition of not seeing each other for the week before the wedding. If you're doing that, then this moment, the moment where the two people come together, is the first moment that they see each other in a week. That I've been to weddings where that has been the case. It is extremely powerful to watch. Rachel and I did not. We didn't abstain from seeing each other, so that wasn't the case at our wedding. All right, so then we're continuing on the parts of a Jewish wedding ceremony. We're up to Kidushin. So the first half of the wedding ceremony is betrothal, Kidushin. We're going to talk more about Kidushin and about whether Kidushin can happen for a couple that is not heterosexual. So this is the piece of the Jewish wedding ceremony where some rabbis have trouble with the idea that it could be for anything other than a man and a woman. So, and we're going to talk about why that's so, and when we look at the text of Kiddushin itself. So then there's Nisuin. Nisuin is the Sheva Brachot. The Sheva Brachot can be said at any wedding, so it's like there are some language that might be shifted, but the idea of the Sheva Brachot is the Sheva Brachot, and like most rabbis have no trouble with the Sheva Brachot for any wedding. So I skipped, as part of Kiddushin, that's where you have the exchange of rings and the declaration of sanctification. Then Nisuin, then Yichud, then those same Sheva Brachot that occurred in Nisuin are said at every meal that the couple is present at for the first 7 days of their marriage. And so that's another opportunity for being able to celebrate with many, many more people and to have that opportunity to share your joy in many contexts. And the rule of the Sheva Brachot is you only say those blessings if the couple are present and there is somebody who has not been at any other Sheva Brachot for the couple, including the wedding. So it's actually like a really beautiful thing that there have to be panim chadashot, new faces. So it's sort of like the way that the community introduces all of the other young couples to each new young couple is through this process of Sheva Brachot parties. Okay. All right. So we're going to do now a deeper dive into same-sex marriage and what it tells us about marriage in general. So, first of all, the teshuvah, the conservative movement teshuvah, from which much of this material is drawn, is called Rituals and Documents of Marriage and Divorce for Same-Sex Couples by Rabbis Elliot Dorff, Daniel Nevins, and Avram Reisner, and was written in 2012. It includes language for both gay weddings and lesbian weddings, for queer weddings, for weddings that are both men and both women. I didn't feel like it was necessary to present every different gendered text of this to you, because there isn't a significant difference between the language for the women and the language for the men, except that the Hebrew verbs are a different gender. So I went with the men. I did that because the two of my colleagues who shared with me what they did at their wedding happened to both be men. And so I wanted to be able to share like the differences between these different weddings. And by looking at the differences in these 4 different weddings, we're going to be able to really, I think, understand deeply what is going on in a Jewish wedding. So hopefully this will be interesting to you. I think it's interesting to me. All right, so the first part of the wedding is Erusin or Kidushin, the blessing of betrothal. And so we start by looking at the traditional, what it says in the Talmud is the wedding, is the blessing of betrothal. All right. So this is what the Talmud says. Blessed are you, God, ruler of the universe, who sanctified us through mitzvot and commanded us concerning the forbidden relationships and prohibited to us those women who are betrothed and permitted to us those women who are married by means of the wedding canopy and betrothal. Blessed are you, Lord, who sanctifies Israel by means of the wedding canopy or betrothal. So that's the first blessing of the wedding. And you also say Borei Priya Gafen. So it's Borei Priya Gafen and this blessing. And this is the first blessing at a Jewish wedding. Now, we tend not to translate it. We tend to say something that's more like, this is the blessing of betrothal, and then we say something nice. We don't usually read the actual direct translation. But this is what happens at most Jewish weddings. Oh. All right, so this idea of, right, that Jewish law prohibits certain kinds of relationships and permits certain kinds of relationships, that's the piece that many folks sort of feel like you can't say this piece at a gay wedding because some people still understand Jewish law to be prohibiting certain kinds of homosexual relationships. So the Dorf Nevins Reisner tshuva, the 2012 tshuva that I just mentioned above, says, okay, here's what you should say for that blessing. Our God and God of our ancestors, look down from your holy abode from heaven and bless these loving companions who are together creating a covenant of lovers. Praised are you, Adonai, who is good and does good. So instead of doing praised are you, Adonai, who sanctifies Israel by means of the wedding canopy and betrothal, it's Baruch atah Adonai Hatova Meitiv. Hatova Meitiv is already a blessing, so they're not inventing something new. They are imposing the blessing of that you say upon hearing good news onto the wedding ceremony, because of course the wedding ceremony is good news. So it's creative. Oops. It's creative, and it is not the traditional nusach of the wedding. It is very different. And I think there are beautiful parts of that and challenging parts of that. Okay. So I brought two different actual Maaseh Shehaya. These are actual weddings that occurred, both of rabbinical students who overlapped with me in rabbinical school, who both got married to male partners, both men who got married to other men. And you'll see that the Goldberg column follows Dorf Nevins Reisner very closely, but makes changes, and that the Abelman column follows the traditional Talmudic text very closely, but makes changes. And these are two different conceptions of what it means to do a gay wedding. Should it be something new, or should it be something as close to the traditional text as possible? So the Goldberg wedding says, right, our God and God of our ancestors, look down from your holy abode from heaven and bless these loving companions who are together creating a covenant of lovers. So they took the same paragraph from Dorf Nevins Reisner, but they used a different already existing blessing. Baruch atah Hashem Eloheinu melech haolam zocher habrit v'ne'eman b'brito v'kayam b'ma'amaro. So what are they doing here, right? This couple is creating between themselves a brit ahuvim, a covenant of lovers, or a covenant of love, right? So then they used a blessing that talked about brit, that talked about covenant. Now, what is this blessing? This is the blessing that you say upon seeing a rainbow in the sky. Praised are you, God, sovereign of time and space, who remembers the covenant, who is faithful to covenant, keeping promises. So they wanted to use this because it's about keeping promises. It's about covenant. It's about being in relationship. It's a blessing that perfectly ends this idea of creating a brit ahuvim, a covenant of lovers. And it also has the added benefit of connecting to their queer identity, because the symbol of the queer identity is the rainbow. And so they were able to have a rainbow flag, and they were able to say the blessing on seeing a rainbow, which connected very beautifully to their to the queer identity. Oh, I think this is brilliant and like so true to them, and I think a better ending than Hatov Ametiv, like because it's more deeply embedded in what they're doing in the idea of covenant itself. I think that if Dorf Nevins Reisner had thought of this, they might have done it themselves in their new stuff. Oh, the Abelman column. They said, who sanctified us through mitzvot and commanded us concerning the forbidden relationships and prohibited to us those men and women who are betrothed and permitted to us those men and women who are married by means of the wedding canopy and betrothal. Blessed are you, Lord, who sanctifies Israel by means of the wedding canopy and betrothal. So where this one doesn't say, right, it just says, Asar lanu et ha'arusot, who forbids us people who are betrothed, but in the feminine, so that it's clear that it means women. They added, Va'asar lanu et ha'arusim ve'ha'arusot, v'hitir lanu et ha'nisuim ve'nisuot. So the only thing that they did to change the traditional text was they made it gender inclusive. Both men and women are forbidden and permitted. So again, we're sort of thinking, okay, what direction do you want to go in? Do you want to make do you want to say that Kidushin is allowed even for gay marriage, and that part of what makes a Jewish wedding is Kidushin, that is this blessing, the blessing that says that certain things are permitted and certain things are forbidden, and that sanctifies this idea of that your relationship is holy, okay, which is what that is supposed to be doing, right? Blessed are you, God, Mikadesh Amo Yisrael. God sanctifies Israel through this ceremony of chuppah, okay? Can you do that if it's a gay wedding? So here we see, right, the tshuva of the conservative movement suggests perhaps not, but an actual Maseh Shahaya of a conservative rabbi who got married, they did do Kiddushin. And so, and there's a question, right? What is better, to do something that's super meaningful, like the blessing on the rainbow, or to do something that's super traditional, like this blessing of Kiddushin? Now that this text exists, the Abelman text, okay, I believe that we should do that text for all Kiddushin, because it's more inclusive. Why would we then use the Talmudic text that only talks about women when we could talk about women and men and be as gender inclusive as possible? So to me, the fact that we have this version, which was created for a gay wedding, like, I think leads us to also think about what does it mean to do for an egalitarian wedding? Should we be thinking about being more inclusive in our language and not just assuming that it's only the women who are permitted or forbidden to the men, as if the only people who are active in this is the men? Well, no, like we're all, like both parties are active. So that's the this blessing of Erusin. All right, moving on. We have the formal declaration and the exchange of rings, which is also part of this Kidushin part of the wedding. And again, right, what we say, what is traditionally said, is very ancient and comes from the Talmudic literature and the codes. So our particular text comes from the codes, not from because we say something that's in Hebrew, and the Talmud was written in Aramaic. So the Talmud's version, Haveli le'intu, be my wife, is Aramaic. We don't say that anymore. We say that basically a translation of that into Hebrew. So that's why I gave the quote here from Evan Ha'ezer, which is a code, as opposed to giving it from the Talmud, because we don't actually say what it says in the Talmud. Oh, probably at a wedding that you were at, you heard the groom say, "Harei at mikudeshet li b'tabat zo kedat Moshe Yisrael." Behold, you are consecrated to me with this ring as my wife, in accordance with the laws of Moshe and the people of Israel. And indeed, right, traditionally, only the man gives the woman the ring, and the woman is sanctified to the man, and the man is the actor. In a traditional Jewish wedding, the woman doesn't say anything. At my wedding, we followed the suggestion in the rabbi's manual, which is that the woman should say something back to the man, but it doesn't. But they traditionally don't say, "Behold, you are sanctified to me." Instead, you say something like, "Ani ledodi v'dodi lo," right? I am my beloved, and my beloved is mine. Or "Ve'irastich li lolam, ve'irastich li b'tzedek u'mishpat v'chesed." I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me with righteousness, with justice, with love and compassion. I will betroth you to me with faithfulness, and you shall love Adonai. Or I am your beloved and you are mine. There are a lot of different options of what you could say. And also, all right, so, and those are the options suggested by our rabbi's manual. None of them have the same legal force. All of them are very beautiful. So let's look at the gay marriage. Dorf Nevins Reisner says, each should say to the other, Heye na li leben zug be'ahava u'va'achva b'shalom u'breut b'nei Elohim v'adam. So, be my covenanted partner in love and friendship and peace and companionship in the eyes of God and humanity. Very nice, right? What did they take out? Kedat Moshe Yisrael, in accordance with the laws of Moses and the people of Israel, right? In the Dorf Nevins Reisner Tshuva of 2012, they were imagining that they were creating something new that wasn't according to the laws of Moses and Israel, but was some other ceremony, right? It wasn't the same. And then both parties should say, right? May it be your will, Adonai, our God, to establish our lifelong household and to bring your presence into our lives. It's beautiful, right? So both parties say something, and then they say something in unison, as opposed to, right, what we said, where, you know, in a traditional heterosexual marriage, only the man speaks, right? The man is the active party, right? And if the woman speaks, she says something that's pretty, but doesn't have any legal force. So what did our actual gay marriages do? So you'll notice that the Goldberg, again, follows the Dorf Nevins Reisner Tshuva, and the Abelman follows the traditional approach. So it is nice to see, right? Again, in this case, there's a tension. Should we be as close to their traditional as possible, or should we be going on the new thing? So, but you'll notice that that Goldberg did not follow Dorf Nevins Reisner fully. They said, Heyen Ali leben brit instead of ben zug, be my covenanted partner. Right? Ben zug just means partner. The English says covenanted partner, but they made that also obvious in the Hebrew, brit. and they said, Kedat Moshe Yisrael, according to the laws of Moses and Israel. So they put it back in. They said, okay, we don't think that what we're doing isn't according to the laws. This is a legal ceremony. This is according to the laws. This is what it means to be connected to the religion of our people. But we each want to say this beautiful thing about becoming a covenanted partner, and we're going to say this blessing together. So it's equivalent and then in unison. Really beautiful. The Abelman text, they both said, Hare ata mikudash li b'tabad zo kedat Moshe Yisrael. By this ring you are consecrated to me as my partner, as my husband, right? In accordance with the laws of Moses and the people of Israel. And they both said that. They both said the same thing. So now that we have that we could have both parties say the same thing, why not do that also for egalitarian marriage? And I have been to weddings where that has happened, where instead of saying something beautiful but having no legal weight, the woman also says, behold, you are consecrated to me with this ring, in the same way that the man says, you are consecrated to me. And I think that's much more egalitarian, really beautiful. I really love this idea, though, of having both parties say something in unison. It's really nice. And this idea of becoming a ben brit is actually, in some ways, more has perhaps more meaning to me, this idea of a covenanted relationship, than this idea of being mikudash, of being sanctified. However, I think ultimately, one of the things that makes a Jewish wedding Jewish is this idea of Kidushin, of being sanctified. That part of what makes a Jewish wedding is Kidushin, is the idea that the wedding is a ceremony of sanctification, of setting apart, of saying, you are consecrated to me and to no one else. And I think that is actually a deeply important part of what makes a Jewish wedding a Jewish wedding. And so I think the Dorff-Nevins-Reisner thing, even though it's beautiful, right, especially the Goldberg version of it, I really like it, but I don't think it satisfies me enough, right? In this case, I'm more on the Abelman side of things. Like, let's use the traditional text, but make it, because we want to do Kiddushin, but let's do it in an egalitarian, in a fully equal way. All right, any questions up to this point? All right, yeah, Barbie. You have to unmute.
Have you officiated at any same-sex marriages?
Not yet. Hopefully.
Which one of these formats, or would it be up to the couple?
It would be up to the couple. I mean, I would do a version of this presentation with the couple if they were interested, or if they said, Rabbi, we don't really care what we say, just make it Jewish, then, then I would choose what. But I would like to think that they would care, that they would want to know what they were saying, and that they were saying something that was meaningful to them. So I wouldn't give them what Dorff-Nevins-Reisner wrote in 2012. My guess is that Rabbi Nevins, who I know pretty well, who was the dean of the rabbinical school while I was there, my guess is that he wouldn't give people this text anymore, that in the decades since 2012, he has evolved somewhat on this. And my guess is that he probably also believes now that it is Kedat Moshe Yisrael to get married in this way, and that he probably regrets not having that language in there. At the time, in 2012, there was a dissenting or a concurring opinion that Rabbi Aaron Alexander wrote, and Rabbi Aaron Alexander said to take the language of Kedat Moshe Yisrael out does a real disservice. And so the Goldberg column is really following Aaron Alexander's concurrent version of the Dorff-Nevins-Reisner tshuva. So, I do think that my friend Ben Goldberg, like I do think that he did some innovating, but he wasn't the only one who was frustrated with that particular aspect of Dorf Nevins Reisner. In fact, when it was written, other people on the law committee, on the Committee for Jewish Law and Standards, also were frustrated that language was taken out. You know, and like I said, my guess is that Rabbi Nevins also regrets that. Yeah, I hope to do all you know, beautiful wedding ceremonies for many folks who are in love over the course of my career, including same-sex marriage. And it hasn't happened yet. All right, so then we get the Sheva Brachot. So let's read the Sheva Brachot. What do the Sheva Brachot actually say? And are they gendered? That's a question. So the first one, of course, is Borei Priya Gafen. That one is not gendered. That stays the same. So this is just the other 6. So the first one is Shehakol Bara Lichvodo. And if you look across, you can see Dorf Nevins Reisner, Shehakol Bara Lichvodo, Goldberg, Shehakol Bara Lichvodo, Abelman, Shehakol Bara Lichvodo. All of these are the same. And it means whose glory is evident in all of creation. Okay, so the second one, Yotzer Ha'adam. You can see Yotzer Ha'adam, Yotzer Ha'adam. Oh, and we're back to, by the way, what it says in the Talmud. So these are very ancient blessings. Yotzer Ha'adam, right? Creator of humankind, or creator of humanity. You know, different ways to translate it, but humankind, humanity. When it says Ha'adam here, it doesn't mean like Adam, it means humanity, humankind. All right, the third one. Asher yatzar et ha'adam b'tzalmo, b'tzelem demut tavnito, v'hitkin lo mimenu binyan adei ad, baruch atah Hashem yotzer ha'adam. So who created humankind in the divine image, that together they might perpetuate life. So that blessing really means that procreation is part of the creative process, and that procreation is part of what marriage comes into the world to do. And so that blessing perhaps needs to be shifted for a wedding that contains folks who are not biologically able to reproduce together. Now, let me add, like, one question that I have with regard to that is, say you have a septuagenarian who is marrying another septuagenarian, right? They're both second marriages, okay? They're in their 70s. Would you, that one's a man and one's a woman, you're still going to do the Sheva Brachot. Would you want to change this blessing just because you know that no children are going to come from this marriage? Biological children, right? Maybe these 70-year-old people are going to adopt together. I don't know. But like, would you say, oh, we can't say this blessing of the Sheva Brachot because these people are too old to have kids? I don't think you would. So maybe by that logic, you can just say that blessing at all marriages, no matter whether kids are going to come from it or not, right? But maybe if you're two men or two women, it's uncomfortable for you to have a blessing said at your wedding that talks so explicitly about the idea of procreation, biological procreation as a part of it. I don't know. So let's look at some of the different options. So Dorf Nevins Reisner, they suggest instead of the language of v'hitkin lo mimenu binyana deyad, that together they might perpetuate life. In other words, procreate. So instead they say ve'amar lo tov heyot adam levado eseh lo ezer kenegdo. So again, who created humanity or humankind in the divine image, who structured us in the image of God, and said it is not good for a person to live alone. I will make a fitting helper for each one. Praised are you, Adonai, creator of humanity. So what they've done there is they've rooted their text in the same story that the blessing is rooted in. And they've said, what is marriage really about? Marriage is really about finding a partner to live your life together with. And azer kenegdo, which, right, that is to say, a helpmeet, a partner who challenges you to be the best version of yourself, a partner who, goes through the good and the bad together with you. Okay, so now that you know that it's possible to say that blessing instead of vihitkin lo mimenu binyana deyad, would you want to have that blessing said at your wedding, even if you were heterosexual, right? Maybe you don't want procreation to be the thing that is implied by the blessing at your marriage. That's very pressury. Maybe instead you want to say, I can also quote this verse from the Torah that talks about what it means to be a partner one to the other. So we see that the Goldberg wedding followed Dorfnevin's Reisner and did exactly what they suggested. And the Abelman wedding followed the Bavli Ketubah and just did, even though they knew that it was referring to procreation, I think they figured, well, yeah, we're two men, but we might procreate in some way. Maybe we'll have a surrogate. Maybe we'll have adoption. Like our relationship will also perpetuate life. And even if it's not biologically perpetuation, we can understand it more symbolically. So I think they understood that in a similar way to the understanding that you might have about two 70-year-old people who are getting married. Like the blessing is still meaningful even if this marriage is not going to produce biological children. So again, two different rabbinical students, two different approaches to this question of, should we do something new or should we do something more traditional? I guess, like for me, it's wonderful that v'hitkin lo mimenu binyana deyad is the same thing that Jews have been saying in the Sheva Brachot since the Talmudic times and before, right? There's a way in which, wow, we've been saying the same blessings, but also, right, adding in lo tov heyod adam le'ado is really beautiful. I really like that. Maybe I would want to do that in my heterosexual wedding. This liturgy wasn't available at the time that I got married because it wasn't really published for the. I got married in 2012, the same year that this was published. It wasn't readily available, so we didn't look at the gay wedding liturgy and say, oh, what part of that gay wedding stuff do we want to take into our heterosexual wedding? That wasn't a thing that people thought about a decade ago, but now it really is. All right. Let's keep going. So the next couple, so the one that's labeled 4 is about Jerusalem, and you'll see it's the same in all 4. So we're not going to focus on it. The next one says, Sameach tisamach re'im ha'ovim, kisamecha yitzircha began Eden mikedem, baruch atah Hashem mesameach chatan vekala. Grant perfect joy to these loving companions as you did for your first human beings in the Garden of Eden. Praised are you, Adonai, who creates the joy of the bride and the groom. So, Dorfnevin's Reisner, again, used Hatova Metiv. So, they said, Sameach tisamach re'im ha'ovim, kisamecha yitzircha began Eden mikedem, baruch atah Hashem Hatova Metiv. I think they had this idea that you shouldn't make up a new blessing. Instead, you should use a blessing that already exists. Hatov Metiv is a beautiful blessing. It already exists. And it's the blessing that you say on good news. Great, so they incorporated it. Oh, again, that sort of feels like a cop-out in some ways. Like, oh, you're doing something that's not actually the wedding liturgy. So what did the Goldberg did? They ended Baruch Atah Hashem Mesameach Re'im Ha'ovim, right? Praised are you Adonai, who creates the joy of loving companions. Since Re'im Ha'ovim is already in the blessing as in the beginning part, even in the traditional text, Sameach Tesamach Re'im Ha'ovim, beloved lovers, the loving companions, right? So praised are you, God, who makes joy for the beloved lovers, for the loving companions, right? I think that's beautiful. If I were getting married again, I might just want to say Baruch Atah Hashem Mesameach Re'im Ha'ovim, because that's so inclusive and deeply embedded in the text of the bracha itself. Another option is what Abelman did, and they did the traditional blessing, but they ended Misameach Chatan V'Chatan. So all they changed was, instead of saying Chatan V'Kala, they changed it to Chatan V'Chatan, who creates the joy of groom and groom, right? And that's another option. Do exactly the traditional liturgy and only change what you have to change for the sake of your wedding. All right, and the final blessing is the longest one. Who created joy and gladness, bride and groom, pleasure and song, delight, laughter, love and harmony, peace and companionship. Adonai our God, may there always be heard in the cities of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem voices of joy and gladness, voices of bride and groom, jubilant voices of those joined in marriage under the chuppah, voices of young people feasting and singing. Praised are you, Adonai, who causes the groom and the bride to rejoice together. So I really love that in the fifth blessing, it's Misameach Chatan V'Kala, who creates the joy of the bride and the groom separately, their individual joy. And in the seventh blessing, it's Misameach Chatan Im Hakala, that it's the joy of the two of them together, their joy in each other. So I really find that really beautiful. So what did Dorf Nevins Reisner do? First of all, they changed any place where it said bride and groom, they replaced with other beautiful words. So the traditional says Chatan V'Kala, Asher bara sason v'simcha Chatan V'Kala. So they have Asher bara sason v'simcha Osher Uvracha. So they put in happiness and blessing instead of Chatan V'Kala. Okay, then you have Gila Rina Ditza V'Ched V'Av V'Vach V'Shalom V'Rayut. All right, the next time that it says Kol Chatan V'Kol Kala, right? So it says Kol Sason V'Kol Simcha. Instead of saying Kol Chatan V'Kol Kala, they say Kol Gila V'Kol Rina. So they went back to gladness and happiness. And then instead of saying Kol Mitzalot Chatanim Mechupatam, instead of saying the voices of the young people feasting and singing under the chuppah, they said the voices of people who say, praised is God, whose faithfulness is eternal. And then they ended with Baruch Atah Hashem Shechianu V'Kimanu V'Gianu Lazman Hazeh. Again, like Hatov HaMeitiv, it's a blessing that is not part of the traditional wedding liturgy, but which does speak to a joyous occasion. Again, I feel like nowadays, probably they wouldn't say to do it this way, because right, they were really trying to innovate a decade ago when nobody had gay weddings in the conservative movement, basically, and they were trying to say, yes, you can have a gay wedding, right? Now a lot of people have had gay weddings in the conservative movement, and they want, queer people want the wedding to be more like a traditional wedding than Shechianu. Shechianu, that's not said at a traditional wedding. Oh, okay. Here's my problem with the Goldberg version. So they put in Ahuv V'Reya. Anytime that it said Chatan V'Kala, they put in Ahuv V'Reya, which means the beloved and the friend, or the loving companions, the beloved lovers, right? So, and it's the same idea as Re'im Ahuvim. So, Asher bara sason v'simcha, Ahuv V'Reya, Gila Rinat, etc. So, and they ended Misameach Re'im Ahuvim. So what they lost is because they have Misameach Re'im Ahuvim in the fifth one and Misameach Re'im Ahuvim in the next one, they lost the ability to have the word im as opposed to the word vi. So the intensity doesn't ramp up. It's the same ending. But saying who causes the loving companions to rejoice together, that's beautiful. That's really nice. What did the Abelman text do? They just, anytime that it said kala, they replaced it with chatan. So shebara sason v'simcha, chatan v'chatan, ilarina dita v'cha, etc. And they ended mesameach chatan ima chatan. Who the groom and the groom should rejoice together. All right, thoughts, comments, reflections. All right. Well, let's keep going. I really do want to share with you some stuff about the Ketubah. All right. So we're not going to read all of this text. We just don't have time. But I will make available this slideshow so that you can spend some time reading the text. But this is the direct translation of the Aramaic text of the Ketubah from the RCA, which is the Orthodox Rabbinical Council of America. This is a direct translation of what the traditional Orthodox Ketubah says. And you can see that it's the only active party is the man. The man says, "Be my wife according to the practice of Moses in Israel, and I will cherish, honor, support you, and maintain you in accordance with the custom of Jewish husbands. And I present you with the marriage gift." Right? If you're a virgin, then you get 200 silver zuzim. If you're not a virgin, you only get 100, which belongs to you. And I promise to give you food and clothing and necessities and live with you as husband and wife according to universal custom. That means have sex. Okay, and then the virgin consented and became his wife. And then the amount of money that she brings into the wedding as a dowry, the trousseau from her father's house, that is listed. And then the bridegroom gets to also offer even more money, all of that together, and then you list how much it is worth altogether. And then he declares, "I take the responsibility for this marriage contract, including all of these additional sums, and I lien all of my property in payment to that." And then the important thing is that the witnesses have seen the legal formality of this kinyan, okay, and that all of this has been done in accordance with the law. So kinyan, acquisition, is one of the pieces that is a part of Jewish marriage. So what is being acquired? Traditionally, what's being acquired is the woman, or the sexual access of the woman by the man. That is no longer what we mean when we say acquisition, when we say acquired in a wedding. I like to think of it as being a mutual acquisition each of the other, and an acquisition each of the marriage itself. So I think that Jewish marriage is about creating something that is greater than the sum of the parts. That is to say, the marriage itself becomes an entity. And rather than, so in a secular wedding or Christian wedding, the marriage is vows made by one party to the other party, and by the other party to the first party, okay? In Jewish marriage, it is a commitment, covenant, an agreement that both parties make to the marriage itself, to the union of the two of them. As opposed to, right, that is to say, they both agree to be in this marriage, and that marriage comes with obligations and responsibilities, each to the other. Those obligations and responsibilities might, in fact, sound very similar to the laws, to the vows. Like, I promise to honor and cherish and support you, right? But it's not a promise to do that. It is an expectation that will happen because you've agreed to be in covenanted partnership with this person. So that to me is a very different formulation, or it might be that the same things are being discussed, but the formulation of them is different in Jewish marriage than in secular marriage. So here is the Ketubah, the conservative movement Ketubah, with the Aramaic, with the Lieberman clause, which we talked about earlier. The Lieberman clause being this paragraph here that says that if either contemplate the dissolution of their marriage or following the dissolution of their marriage in the civil courts, each may summon the other to the Beit Din of the Rabbinical Assembly and the Jewish Theological Seminary or its representative, that each will abide by its instructions, so that throughout life each will be able to live according to the laws of Torah. In other words, that they promise to give a get. Right? So that's the Lieberman clause in our Ketubah. Other than that, it's very similar to the one that the Orthodox includes, including that, like, my rabbi's manual still tells me that, you know, you should write a lower number if the woman is not a virgin, which is astounding to me that is still in my rabbi's manual. Like, that feels to me like we should not be doing that anymore. Like, the virginal status of the woman has anything to do with this covenant. All right, so the Dorf Nevins Reisner Tshuva creates something called a Brit Ahovim, a covenant of lovers. Right? It's a little different from a Ketubah and a little bit the same as a Ketubah. Okay, so the text of it doesn't have anything to do with money. It says, let it be known that our souls are bound one to the other with bonds of love and mutual devotion, and that it is our intention with God's help to be exclusively faithful to each other, as our sages taught. And then there's a quote, share secrets of Torah and secrets of life. We shall share from this day a complete partnership, joyfully and wholeheartedly establishing a household in common, moral and financial responsibilities. We will be loving partners. We, the witnesses, attached to. Okay, so it's beautiful, but it is very different from the text of the Ketubah. It doesn't have that sense of, oh, this is a Ketubah text. Now, is this binding? Like, yeah, it is. I get, you know, okay. So what did our rabbis do? So here's Goldberg. They wrote their own Ketubah, and it says, okay, they committed their intention to jointly participate in creating a Bayit Ne'eman B'Yisrael, a faithful house. The two of them, Daniel and Ben, agreed that this covenant would be sanctified like earlier covenants of our people that were made in faith and peace to stand eternally. It should be an eternal covenant. This is a covenant of guardianship and hope, just like the covenant that God swore to Noah and his descendants, and then it's a quote from Genesis. This is a covenant of treasuring one another, like the covenant that God made with the Jewish people, as it written, you shall be my people and I will be your God. This is a covenant of friendship and intertwined souls, like the covenant made between David and Jonathan. As it is written, Jonathan's soul became bound up with the soul of David. David and Jonathan made a covenant because he loved him as his soul. This is a covenant of mutual loving kindness, like the covenant that God made with Jerusalem, as is written, etc. Okay, Daniel and Ben announced that they've each chosen the other as friends and fellows, as our rabbis taught, and then that same quote that was in the Dorf Nevins Reisner one, a person should find a partner with whom to eat, drink, sleep, study, and share every secret, secrets of Torah and secrets of life. So to study, to dwell with, tell secrets to, both religious and secular. They sanctify themselves each to the other and commit not to sanctify themselves to other lovers. Sorry. They accept upon themselves all the obligations of belonging as family, and to enact this idea of, let me be a seal upon your heart, like the seal upon your hand, for love is as fierce as death. Okay. So it's very beautiful. It's very deeply Jewish. It's connected to all of these different covenants. I think it's gorgeous, right? And maybe it should be used for all Ketubot instead of the Ketubah text that we have that is so focused on money and like the value of the dowry and whatnot. Okay, it's an interesting thought. What did the Abelman Ketubah do? Well, they used the traditional Ketubah mostly. Okay, on the first day of the week, here in Waltham, blah, 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 then they have these two joint paragraphs. Instead of just saying, you know, they each said to the other, they actually said, right, we're testifying that Ari said to Sam, be my husband according to the laws of Moses and the Jewish people. And Sam said to Ari, be my husband according to the laws of Moses and the Jewish people. So that's very nice, like this side-by-side version. The grooms announced that they would each choose each other as friends and fellows as a rabbi taught, and then that same quote. The grooms accepted upon themselves of their own will to live a family life and to build themselves a faithful house is accepted among the Jewish people. They also took upon themselves responsibility for the money and the furnishings coming in with them into the marriage. So they incorporated that idea from the traditional Ketubah. They added in this paragraph, if this marriage should dissolve in the civil court, or if one of the grooms leave their house with the intention to dissolve the marriage, and within 6 months of that time, each of the grooms send to the other a get, according to the laws of Moses and the Jewish people, then this marriage will have been considered valid. But if after 6 months the grooms have not sent each other divorce documents, then this marriage itself should be considered annulled and canceled as if it had never happened. So this is another way of dealing with the aguna, the chained partner problem. That is writing into the ketubah itself that the marriage is conditional on the marriage ending with a get. And if the marriage ends and no get is given, then it undoes the marriage itself. That is, it's sort of like an annulment, which undoes the need for a get. So that's an interesting paragraph. It's also like particularly interesting because they are implicitly saying by putting this in that they believe that their divorce would need a get, right? Which I also believe that it does, because I believe in if same-sex marriage is real marriage, then same-sex divorce has to be real divorce. But they are doing an egalitarian version of giving the get, where both parties have to give a get to the other. All right, so I just want to close with this year in 2020, the conservative movement came out with an egalitarian ketubah text, which is for heterosexual couples, that is, very similar to the traditional ketubah, but which is much more egalitarian. So we testify, blah, 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 blah. The groom said this to the bride, and the bride said the same thing to the groom, and it's side by side. So that's very similar to what the Abelman groom and groom did, Ari and Sam. That's very similar, but it's, so you can do this for anyone. Like, you could use this text also for a gay marriage. You just change it to the groom said to the groom. Okay, for a total of 400 zuzim. So in other words, I give you 200 zuzim, you give me 200 zuzim. Together we have a pot that is 400 zuzim. They will control their property equally. The groom and the bride said, we take upon ourselves and our heirs after us the obligation of this ketubah to be paid from the best part of our property, whatever. Like, so in other words, we're committing jointly to have this marriage money, that if the divorce happens, that we're going to take care of each other. So I've used this text with a couple that I officiated at their marriage this past fall. This text had just come out, and the only thing that I did to change it was, instead of using the words groom and bride, which the couple didn't want to be seen as using those words, they didn't feel like that those words met their values. So I used the words ahu v'reya, right? Beloved lovers. The beloved lovers, or loving companions, each one of them said to the other, be my loving companion. So I made it fully gender neutral. But I used this same text, and then they took upon themselves all of the obligations and strictures of the ketubah, and they each said to each other that they're going to build a house of loving companionship. Then here's the Lieberman clause, make sure that we're going to have, that we're going to give a get if we end. and we have performed this act with an instrument fit for that purpose. All right, so that's an egalitarian ketubah that's written very recently. So what makes a Jewish wedding Jewish? Anybody have answers that are different from the answers that we said at the beginning? Henry.
I don't know, it just seems that Jewish weddings tend to be, even though we've talked about tradition over the eons, currently it seems like Jewish weddings are, I can't think of the right word. I'm thinking of manipulative, but that's such a negative word. It's, do what you need to do to make it sound the best that you think it should be.
All right, so I think Jewish wedding should meet our values, the values of our moment.
Sounds good.
Good, I certainly hope so. I certainly hope that the way that we get married also, the way that we do a wedding also reflects the values that we have for our marriage, values of egalitarianism and shared partnership, and going into this together, for sure. Yeah.
Seems to me we're in very trying times because there's a lot of people sort of trying to focus on all of this, the newness of how we say things, and are we still not saying, are we not still saying the same thing that we've always said, but in trying to make it in ways that is palatable to the new society?
Yeah. Anybody else? What makes a Jewish wedding a Jewish wedding? So I want to focus on two things. The first is the idea of Kidushin, of being set apart, sanctified each to the other. I think that concept is really important. Now, I want to describe that concept in an egalitarian way. I don't want it to be just a one-directional Kidushin, but I think that Kidushin is a really important part of Jewish wedding. And then there's this idea of Kabbalat Kinyan, accepting the obligations. So unlike secular wedding that's all about vows, Jewish wedding is all about accepting obligations. And what obligations are these? That they're the same things that the people are vowing to, that to honor, to cherish, to be in relationship, to love, to hold, right? All of those sort of things are the things that are important for a marriage. But in Judaism, we accept the marriage, we buy in to the marriage, we take on the responsibilities of the marriage, and joining that covenanted partnership comes with obligations, comes with responsibilities that you have each to the other. And so when I talk about Jewish wedding with folks, I say, hey, you're not actually making promises to the other person. You're making a promise to yourself to join the marriage, and that marriage comes with obligations. Those obligations are each to the other, but to me, that feels really significantly different. And I guess whatever text of the Ketubah you use, whatever text of the Sheva Brachot you use, like, you should be thinking about them, or one could think about them in relationship to these two ideas, that it's an idea of a sanctified relationship, and that it's an idea where the relationship, the covenant, the brit that you are entering into is greater than the sum of its parts and comes with obligations each to the other. And that's true no matter whether it's a heterosexual or same-sex marriage. And I think that by looking at the nusach, the text of these different weddings, we can really learn a lot about what the values are and why you would change these little words, how that can really affect what you mean and what the values are. And I think that that's really important. All right, so we've come to the end of our program. I just wanted to open it up for any comments or questions, and we'll close.
Thank you, Rabbi. I learned.
Yeah, ditto.
Yeah.
Rabbi, I really like the way you kind of, I won't say you did it backwards, given that you wanted to look at the same-sex marriage almost primarily, you really set a good stage for looking at this latter part. It really helped get it in the right context.
I learned that 1,000-year rule expired.
Okay, Gary.
Yeah, the Takana of
There we
Rabbeinu
go.
Gershom.
Gary's really interested in us.
Yeah, he's got somebody in mind.
Yeah, right.
Watch
I
out,
just wanna-
Deborah.
I'm worried. I'm very worried.
We'll be your witnesses that he's already acting a little,
All right.
I'm really concerned.
Henry,
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm just curious if your friend Ben ever used the musical idea of the fact that he was writing Goldberg variations.
I was wondering, because this is a discussion that Rob and I had many years ago, about the tradition of the bride walking around.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So there were a few
No.
things that I felt like we didn't have time for, but which I did research. So let's see. I made notes. Okay.
We did.
Both the Goldberg wedding and the Abelman wedding used the custom of circling, where each partner circled the other 3 times, followed by a do-si-do. So they did 3 and 3 and a do-si-do. That is to say, right, a do-si-do where you both circle each other at the same time.
Right.
That, by the way, has become also very common in heterosexual weddings. But why should one couple do one partner do all 7 circles? Like 3 and 3 in a do-si-do has become sort of very in vogue.
Bob, way ahead of the curve.
Oh, is that what you did? 3 and 3 in a do-si-do?
We did it together. Yeah.
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 Rachel just circled me 7 times. We actually weren't going to have circling as part of our wedding.
I was getting busy.
It was the one thing that my Zeta did our wedding, and he was like, and then you'll circle. And he also said, and then I'll bring in witnesses that I approve. And we were like, no, we're going to ask our friends to be our witnesses, and you're going to approve them. And then he said, and then we'll do the circling. And we were like, well, we won on the witnesses thing, so we don't care really about the circling. So Rachel just did the circling. I used to think that 3 and 3 in a do-si-do just seemed kind of foolish. Like if you were going to do it, like do it the traditional way, or just skip that thing altogether, that circling, because that's not, so important. But I've been to a lot of weddings where they've done 3 and 3 in a do-si-do now, and it's actually kind of nice. There's something very, egalitarian about it, and so I like that. Both partners, both of the Goldberg and Abelman weddings, both did kind of a kittel ceremony in the place of a bedekin, where they each dressed the other in the kittel. So they did that, and Right, so Ben Goldberg wrote to me, he said, the problem about ritual creativity is that inclusivity is being bought at the price of uniformity. And this is a real loss, because part of what makes the ritual work is that people are going in to know what to expect in the ritual. No one walks into a Seder thinking, I wonder if there'll be matzah. Like, the matzah is a part of it. So if you walk into a wedding and then it happens a little differently, like, inclusivity is being bought at the price of uniformity. I guess how I feel to Ben is like, I don't think that weddings are uniform anymore. Maybe they used to be, where everybody did the same liturgy, but now everybody is doing their own thing. And so uniformity has already gone. So inclusivity is definitely, a value that is powerful. But I think he's right. Like, that's exactly the tension between what the Abelman one, which preferenced uniformity over inclusivity, versus the Dorff-Nevins-Reisner adapted one that the Goldberg one did, which was sort of inclusivity, but at the price of uniformity. And I think that's a huge question. I mean, and I think that's also really, really beautiful. I have the quote from Aaron Alexander that I referred to before. The thematic and religious coherence of the Sheva Brachot is found in the Talmud, powerfully celebrates any marriage consecration between two consenting Jews. Changing that ancient set of 7 blessings is appropriate only to address specific gender preferences, and not to say Hatova Metiv or Shefianu, right? And I think I'm very convinced by Aaron Alexander's point there. I think that makes a lot of sense to me.
How widely known are these 3 versions?
Well,
I mean, are these just a bunch of your friends, or is this something?
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
So in other
right.
words, there could be a Goldstein version out there.
Right.
He's at the rabbinical school.
Right. These are 2 people that I went to rabbinical school with, and I also went to rabbinical school with many other folks who were queer, who got married in also many different ways. What I liked about these 2 examples was that one of them followed Dorff-Nevins-Reisner very closely. That is to say that the way they wanted to do a gay wedding was to follow the halachic advice of the conservative movement's Committee of Jewish Law and Standards. Here's how you should do a gay wedding. And the other was like, we're getting married, we're going to do a traditional wedding, and we're just going to change a couple words.
Okay.
And look, I think both of those are legitimate options. Now, you can access the Dorff-Nevins-Reisner Teshuvah from 2012 on the website of the Rabbinical Assembly. So can everybody. It's like open and free to the public. But I did put the link to that in the PowerPoint, and I can put it in the chat. It is a document of its time, meaning the world has changed in the last decade. And so there are many parts of that, of this teshuvah, that I think even the authors would probably not hold by in its entirety now. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Kol Tuv.
Kam lecha.
Thanks very much.
Yes, that was very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good night, everybody.
Night
Good
all.
night, all. Night.
Good
Good night.
Shalom.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.
I apologize. We had company for dinner and we're cleaning up because we go to bed tonight. So we're paying attention.
That's
Thank you.
Lila Tov.
Lila Tov.